When it comes to services in Kubernetes, we have cluster IP, node port, external name, and load balancer. Let's focus on cluster IP first, and then we'll learn about the rest. So cluster IP is a default Kubernetes service. So when you create a service and you don't specify the type, the default is cluster IP. Now, the cluster IP type is used for internal access and no external. So this is where in scenarios where within your cluster, you have a pod, and then let's say that in our case, because we have two microservices, we have the customer microservice that wants to talk to the order microservice. So, assuming that you've got deployment, replica sets, and all of that stuff, right? So if a pod, so in our case, the customer microservice wants to talk to the order microservice internally, we use the cluster IP type service. So this service will basically send traffic to any pod, right? So any pod which is healthy. So the thing here about services is that the service will only send traffic to healthy pods. And then the customer microservice can then perform a request to the service and not the pod IP address as we've done before. So here, there are a couple of ways that we can do this. We can use the service IP address or the DNS and port, because I've said before that both the DNS IP address and port are stable, so they never change unless you delete it, right? So it's super simple. Let's go ahead and learn about the cluster IP service type. So within VS Code, what we're going to do is the following. So we want basically our customer microservice to talk to our order microservice. So we need to have a service for our order deployment right here. So this deployment right here, which has two replicas right here, so two pods. So we want to create a service that will send traffic to those pods. So we could actually create the service on a separate file, but usually services and deployment, they do go together. Now, if you want to create the service on the same file, just add 3 dashes, just like that. And now you can create a new Kubernetes resource, right? So here I'm going to say service. And again, I never type these from scratch. So I always use auto completion and then enter. And if I scroll down, check this out. So you can see that it's really simple. Have a look. So API version, v1 kind service, metadata. Here, let's go ahead and simply say order. We're going to call this order in here, and then selector. So app, and then my app. So this selector here is very important. So this will tell this service to send traffic to any pod that has a specific set of labels. So in here, so you saw that, have a look. So labels, app, and then order right here. So in here, if I say order, right? So this is the label, key, and then value. So selector app order matches this one. So if I was, for example, to say order and then pod, for example, basically we would need to change this to order pod, right? And that way it will actually send the traffic to whatever pod that this deployment is managing. So here, let me just keep it as order. And then we have ports. So ports right here, we can basically choose a port that we want this service to be associated with. So in our case, let's just say 80 and then 81. So usually you can say port 80, or some people like to keep it the same as the or the port right here. So the one that the pod so the receiving pod has. So this container port. So we can say 8081, and you'll see this in a second. And then the target port right here is the pod right here. So the number, or actually, let me just put my mouse in here. So number or name of the port to access on the pod's targeted by the service. So here, this is 8081. So this and this has to match. Otherwise, this service will send the traffic to whatever port, which might exist or might not. So in here, for example, so ports, you can have another container port. Let's say that you have 3000, for example. So here you can say 3000 as well, right? Then it will send the traffic to this port instead of this one. So let's just keep one port, and then this will be 8081 right here. And again, this is for the service itself. So if I save this right here, and one thing that I want to show you is, so you see in here, you see kind, and if I inside of the spec, if I say type right here and then press Control space, have a look, cluster IP, external, load balancer, node port. So by default, if we don't specify the type, this is the type right here. So that's the default. So I usually like to have the type, even though it's the default, so that it's, clear to anyone looking at this that this is a cluster IP. Again, cluster IP is only used for internal communication. So I'm going to save this. Now let's go back to our terminal. And if I press Control C here for a second, Control L, cube, CTL, apply, and then -F, and then order, and then deployment. And there we go. You can see that here we have service. This is the name of the service was created. And the deployment was actually unchanged because we didn't change the deployment part. So now that we have this service right here called order, next let's go ahead and inspect this service and then make the changes so that the customer microservice points to the service instead of the old IP address which was associated with a pod. Catch me on the next one.